On January 14, 2003, Texas Ranger Sean Palmer and Detective Boyd Wedding from the Terrell Hills Police Department made a horrible discovery at an abandoned farm. An old Datsun truck bed that had been made into a utility trailer sat with half-burned refuse in it. Ranger Palmer walked up to have a peek inside, and the unmistakable odor of decomposition and burnt flesh hit him. What he first saw, however, was a burned up VCR and television, and in the corner of the truck bed was a wrapper that had escaped the flames. It was a Weiler's Authentic Italian Ice wrapper. Palmer had recently learned that Richard McFarland was obsessed with that snack, so Palmer knew when he saw the wrapper that the body of McFarland's wife, Susan, lay beneath that mess. To her friends and family in the upscaled old San Antonio suburb of Terrell Hills, Susan McFarland was the picture of success. She was a CPA and had graduated at the top of her class in college. She had worked her way up into a well-paying executive position at SBC Communications, while she was also a devoted mother to three young boys and skillfully balancing a demanding career with school carnivals and charitable work. Susan and her husband, Richard McFarland, lived in a 1938-built two-story home on Arcadia Place in picturesque Terrell Hills, a small city within San Antonio's boundaries. This perfect picture was shattered on Thanksgiving Day 2002, however, when Susan's husband, Richard, reported she was missing, kicking off a 7-week investigation that concluded with a horrific discovery. Hi, I'm Brenda, and thanks for being here with me at Vintage Texas Crimes. I'm a writer of old Texas crime stories, and that's what this account is all about. If that's your cup of tea, please subscribe or follow me. Thank you. Part 1. This is going to be a long one, so yes, there are 4 parts to it, and I'm going to try to produce them all on one day. I'll do the best I can. Anyhow, Part 1. Where is Susan? Susan and Richard McFarland had been married for 13 years by the time November 2002 came around. Susan was the family's energetic breadwinner. She was witty, cute, and fun. Her husband, however, was neither successful nor energetic. He thought he was really too good to be working for other people, and he didn't have a sense of humor. From the outset, Susan McFarland's case was quirky, and today we can look back and see it foreshadowed another San Antonio case that presented itself in October 2024, when Suzanne Simpson, wife of Brad Simpson, disappeared. There are strong similarities between the two cases. Both missing women were beautiful and kind. People loved them. They were smart and highly successful at their jobs. Each couple had 3 children, and both women had husbands who were controlling and emotionally abusive. While the women worked long days, neither of their husbands could be relied upon to even pick up the children from school on time without forgetting about them. Side note, Suzanne Simpson's body has still not been found, and he has been in the Bexar County Jail since October 2024. Currently, it looks like the trial for the Simpson case is going to happen in April or May of 2026. When Richard McFarland reported his wife missing, Terrell Hills Police Sergeant Boyd Wedding saw immediately that the case was not a simple runaway mom situation. Susan McFarland was classified as a missing person with suspicious circumstances. Richard told police he hadn't seen his wife since the evening of Monday, November 25th. 3 days had gone by before he told them she was missing. He insisted there had been no arguments and that Susan had never gone missing before. He didn't understand it. His story to police was that he thought she'd gone to Amarillo for the holiday and left their children with him. The police reached out to Susan's friends and family, who completely dismantled Richard's story about Amarillo. Okay, then the first clue came around: an abandoned Ford Explorer. On Thanksgiving morning, very early, the first tangible piece of evidence in Susan's missing person investigation presented itself. Richard had not yet reported her disappearance to the Terrell Hills Police Department. At 3 a.m. on Thanksgiving morning, a patrol officer discovered Susan's 1997 Ford Explorer abandoned in a vacant field, just 2 miles from her home. The keys were still in the ignition. Sergeant Boyd Wedding contacted Richard McFarland before they knew anything about Susan McFarland missing, and according to Sergeant Wedding, the husband's reaction was strangely calm. There wasn't a whole lot of concern about finding his wife's vehicle with keys in it and her not. And get this, they wanted to come to the house right then and take a report about his wife, whom the husband said he had not seen since November 25th. So, and then it's the 28th when this is going on. He said she left to go visit friends. He told Sergeant Wedding that it was just not a good time for him to come right then. So Richard said, I'll tell you what, I will come to the police department as soon as I can. That put Richard on the radar as the number one suspect, especially when it was 15 hours before he went to the station to pick up the keys and report his wife missing. Now, talk about a guy who just doesn't know how to read a room. That was law enforcement's first big red flag about this case. Missing person posters bearing Susan McFarland's smiling face appeared in the local store windows and gathering places. The case that began with Richard McFarland's half-hearted report on a missing wife soon escalated. As days turned into a week, the news spread and a chill settled over Terrell Hills. Terrell Hills Police Department reached out to the Texas Rangers and said they might need assistance soon. Part 2, the neighbor's garage. I have followed crimes since I was 18 years old, and I have never seen this one before. It's the day after Thanksgiving, November 29th, 2002. One of McFarland's neighbors, Harriet Wells, had recently sold her home directly across the street. The rumor among the other Arcadia Place neighbors was that the buyer planned to tear it down and build a new luxury home. That gets people thinking and talking. I'm sure there was a lot of buzz going on. At 11:45 a.m. the day after Thanksgiving, Mrs. Wells' real estate agent, Deborah Myers, arrived to take pictures of the house and was surprised to see Richard's white van in her client's driveway. The agent parked her car on the street, got out. Richard saw her from his house and walked over to speak with her. He introduced himself and asked if he should move the van. Myers said it wasn't necessary. The agent told him she was on a tight schedule that day and had already finished taking pictures by the time he had walked across the street, so she was ready to leave. She headed for her car. So, is this house going to be demolished? Asked Richard. Yes, that's the buyer's plan, said Myers over her shoulder, and then came a weird question, even for Richard. Will they demolish the garage too? I'm sure they will, said Myers. Have a nice day, Richard. At the time, she thought little of Richard's question, just that it was kind of weird and that the neighbor she had just met was a weird guy. Later in the day, Harriet Wells arrived at her former home to move out more of her belongings. Before she arrived, Deborah Myers had called her about Richard parking in the front driveway. Harriet Wells did not like Richard McFarland, so she always pulled in from the alley into her back driveway to avoid him. So the white van was not a problem to her. When she opened her garage, however, she was shocked. Parked inside was a blue and tan Chevrolet Suburban that did not belong to her or anyone she knew. And already, Harriet Wells was thinking, Richard, what have you done? She looked inside of the SUV and found shopping bags with merchandise in them. She also found a wallet, which confirmed what she was thinking. Inside was a card for AAA bearing the name Richard McFarland. Her husband said he'd call Richard and tell him to get this vehicle out of their garage. Harriet said no, she didn't want to bother with him right then, and she was going to call the police and not tell Richard that she had seen what she had seen. But she wasn't going to do it until she had things loaded up that she had come for that day. Across the street, Officer Rick Trevino from the Terrell Hills Police Department rang the McFarland's doorbell. He had come to see if the Explorer was still parked in the driveway and to see if Susan had returned. Trevino walked by the passenger side of the Explorer and looked in. He saw something on the console. The door was unlocked, so he opened it and looked closer. It was blood. The SUV needed to be searched and impounded to see what was going on there and to check for the possibility that that was Susan's blood. He called in an impoundment order so the vehicle would be picked up. That's when he went to the door to tell McFarland what was going on, and the McFarland's 8-year-old son answered. Trevino asked to speak with his mother, and the child said, "You can't bother her right now. She's in a deep sleep, and she cannot be disturbed." "Well, how about your dad?" he asked. "Oh, he's asleep too," said the child. Trevino knew McFarland was not asleep, that he was just hiding, but he left anyhow and did not pressure the little boy to go find his dad. They would be back with the search warrant, so it didn't really matter at that point. Detective Sergeant Boyd Wedding called Texas Ranger Sean Palmer to let him know about the Explorer's impounding. They would need the Ranger's help processing the Explorer and investigating the case. Sean Palmer agreed, and meanwhile, there were two other police officers whose names were not given in the sources. They had arrived and knocked on the door of the McFarland place before Trevino had gotten there. They were supposed to watch him and to know his whereabouts at all times for the present. They needed to confirm he was at home, but McFarland would not answer. So before Trevino got there, they went next door and watched for him from the neighbor's bedroom window. After Trevino left, sure enough, McFarland came out of the house and the police met him downstairs in the yard, but he ran to his car and tore out of the driveway. So they followed him. My sources don't say where they went, but Richard returned 20 minutes later. He went into his garage and came out with a circular saw in hand. He plugged it in and scored a line across his driveway with his saw. Across the street, Harriet watched Richard's curious behavior. The police officers who were still there keeping up with him watched from their car. Officers Homer Delgado and Rick Trevino arrived at Harriet's home regarding the call she had just made, which is across the street from McFarland's house. They were there to see about the Suburban in her garage. They too saw the bizarre sawing of the concrete driveway. Harriet wondered if he was trying to heat up the blade to destroy any DNA that might be on the blade. There was no explanation for that. The Suburban itself was quickly identified as having been stolen from a nearby Texaco gas station owned by a man named Richard Clemmer. Delgado and Trevino began identifying evidence in the SUV. They found the wallet belonging to McFarland. On the bumper, a dark smudge of what looked like blood was also there. In the rear of the SUV, there was a shovel, and scattered around the garage, there were items Harriet insisted were not hers. 2 bags of charcoal, an empty gas container, and insecticide. Of course, the police knew right away those things, at least 2 of those things were for starting fires. And perhaps someone had purchased the insecticide to keep bugs away from a body. So forensics could not tell by the state of the insects how long the body had been there. There was also a great deal of soil and vegetation under the front of the car. Richard Clemmer, the owner of the Texaco station where the vehicle had been for sale, confirmed the Suburban was stolen off his lot on November 25th, the last day that Susan was seen. Clemmer was selling the Suburban on consignment for an acquaintance named Guy Chipman. Clemmer said only one person had taken that specific Suburban for a test drive, Richard McFarland. He had taken it out on November 20th and 22nd and was seen looking under the hood again on November 23rd. Clemmer said that on one of those test drives made by McFarland, he didn't bring the vehicle back for 2 hours, and he blamed the delay on his wife taking it for a drive. When the Suburban was stolen, the keys were not taken from inside the Texaco station. Law enforcement told the San Antonio Express News they believed Richard may have gone to a place to have the keys made while he was out for that 2 hours. And that way he would have been able to steal it a few days later. So they asked for anyone who had made the keys that day for McFarland to call them, but I don't believe anybody did call in, or it wasn't mentioned. Next, we will look behind the scenes at the McFarland's marriage and dig a little deeper into Richard McFarland's peculiar personality. Part 3, Red Flags. For weeks, the public story about the McFarlands was one of a happy family torn apart by mysterious disappearance. But behind the scenes, Susan McFarland was harboring a secret. one that would cast the entire investigation in a new light. When law enforcement heard, she was planning to divorce her husband. She said she just couldn't take it anymore. Her longtime friend, Deanne Dallin, would later tell reporters. She just couldn't handle how he was treating her. He had begun putting his face very close to hers and screaming at her when he was angry. Susan and Richard McFarland had met at a party in 1988 in St. Louis, where both were from. They realized they had once attended the same high school, but had run in different groups. They had never really met before. Richard played water polo. He was involved in drama productions and building sets. Susan was studious, mathematically inclined, and was popular. When they met at the party, Susan was experiencing a very loud ticking of her biological clock. She was drawn to Richard, perhaps at a weak moment when she had just turned 30 years old and was thinking seriously about wanting a family in her future. He was nice looking. He worked for a stock brokerage firm, and at least early on, he seemed like a steady, reliable man. Their dating period was pleasant and uneventful on the surface. Susan was outgoing and quick-witted, often carrying the social energy for the couple, while Richard was quieter and more reserved. And people thought, well, it works for them. Despite the calm exterior, Susan's friends harbored reservations later and Susan wished that she had taken them more seriously. These were big red flags, and like many people who have nesting fever and want to be part of a couple, Susan chose to overlook them, including Richard changing jobs during their engagement without telling her for 3 weeks. He just didn't mention that he was completely going to a different job. More troubling was his mother, a deeply judgmental Bible thumper, who made it clear she believed Susan was not good enough for her son. She was just a good time girl. Yeah. And she did little to hide her dislike of Susan. Susan would later regret dismissing these early warning signs as minor irritations rather than signals of deeper problems. Right after they married, it got worse. Susan learned Richard had a mound of debt he had never mentioned to her. And of course, the logical thing would have been for her to just end the marriage and move on. But that's a lot of pressure to do something like this. Hard. It would be. None of the things about Richard improved. He was just weirder and more deceptive as time went forward. Richard lost his job right after they had married and did not work again for over a year. He did not get along with coworkers or bosses at jobs he was able to get during their marriage. Investigators learned that Richard had developed compulsive shopping habits that went far beyond occasional spending. Richard became fixated on rebate offers, buying items and mailing in the rebate paperwork and then attempting to return the merchandise for a full refund. The behavior escalated to the point where he was banned from Eckerd's Drug, now CVS, and explicitly told not to return. He would purchase expensive electronics such as 2 Palm Pilots at a time, spending around $500 solely to collect small rebates. Then he would return the items, and sometimes he could, and sometimes he couldn't. He also bought discounted merchandise they neither wanted nor needed, driven by the thrill of the purchase rather than necessity. He went to stores in Alamo Heights, bought items, brought them home to resell on eBay, and if he couldn't get a higher bid than what he had paid for the items within, say, however long they gave you to return the items, he would return them to the store for a full refund. Richard's behavior had placed a significant strain on their finances. A month before Thanksgiving, Richard had drained their bank account, and Susan had given him an ultimatum to return the funds. He didn't bother to replace them. Susan's friends told investigators that Susan had hired a divorce attorney on November 12th, 2 weeks before she vanished. She had planned to file the papers on the Monday after Thanksgiving, and she wrote all this in a diary. She wrote a lot about Richard's weird behavior, and she kept it in a file on her computer. She feared a bitter custody battle because of those things for her sons, ages 11, 9, and 5, as Richard was a stay-at-home dad who pretended to run an internet ad sales business from home, but really he was just always losing money. Friends described Richard's behavior as increasingly irritable. He would scold Susan harshly over trivial matters like using seatbelts instead of car seats for their older sons. His inability to hold a steady job wore on Susan, who supported the family's affluent lifestyle with her salary alone. They had moved to Terrell Hills 5 years earlier when her job headquarters shifted there. Richard had hardly worked since they had moved to the San Antonio area. Unknown to Susan or her friends, on the night of November 12, 2002, Richard sat down at his computer and hacked into Susan's computer. That's when he read her electronic journal, and he saw the way she had begun to feel repelled by him, was angry at him, and he saw that she was filing for divorce on the Monday after Thanksgiving. So Richard started making plans of his own. While her friends never witnessed physical abuse, the emotional strain was clear. With this new information, the focus on Richard McFarland intensified. On December 6th, as Richard left his youngest son's school, he was stopped by the Texas Rangers. They escorted him to a police station for questioning and obtained a saliva specimen for a DNA sample. Law enforcement also executed 2 search warrants in November and December. One of them included all the computers in the house. Neighbors recalled seeing Richard with a bandage on his pinky after Thanksgiving, which he said he had hurt from an accident with a handsaw, is one story. And the other story was while he was trying to install or fix the fence. More damningly, Richard made a desperate attempt to obstruct the investigation. After the Suburban was found in Harriet's garage with his belongings in it, he made a visit to Richard Clemmer at the Texaco station, and he asked Clemmer to lie to the police, and then Richard offered a couple of steak dinners to make it worth his while. If he would say what Richard wanted him to, that Richard had permission to take the vehicle. And Clemmer refused. So Richard tried to get him to say that it was Susan that had come and gotten the vehicle. And Clemmer refused that too. Susan stole the vehicle, but Clemmer refused. As investigators dug deeper, a portrait emerged of a man described by those who knew him as difficult. Neighbor Carrie Miller recalled how shortly after the McFarlands moved in, Richard cut down a tree on her property without explanation or apology, except that, well, it was just getting leaves on his side of the fence. Other friends told investigators he was prone to stalking Susan when Susan was visiting a friend or went out. He would drive past the houses of her friends repeatedly, seemingly to just check up and make sure she was still there. There's no end to the list of jarring stories people told about Richard's behavior during his marriage to Susan and after she disappeared. Part 4, a tipster calls in. Now, before I start this, I wanted to tell you that I am sharing a link to my step-by-step timeline in the notes for YouTube. And if you're seeing this on my blog, it will be below this article. Because, you may leave before the end of this or whatever, and I just wanted to make sure you knew that. The case broke open with a phone message. On January 11th, 2003, while reviewing accumulated messages, Terrell Hills Police Detective Sergeant Boyd Wedding found found a message in the stack that had accumulated from the stepson of a man named Gil Medellin, Medellin. I guess that's how you say it. The tip was critical. Medellin reported seeing 2 vehicles, a blue and tan one, and he had told this to his stepson. He had also seen a black Ford Explorer, just like the ones central to the case, and he had seen them out on South W.W. White Road around the time of Susan's disappearance. He had even seen smoke near an old farmhouse in the area on November 27th, but he did not know if that had anything to do with anything. It's just that it happened at the same time that he saw one of the vehicles. Acting on the tip, Ranger Sean Palmer visited Gil Medellin on January 13th to hear the story firsthand. Medellin did not want to get involved, and he had told his friends and his stepson about what he had seen, and they looked into, what was going on with 2 cars that looked like that, and decided that Jim Tutt, the stepson, should call police and let them know about it. Medlin told him no one came out to the area unless they lived there. It's kind of a desolate, untraveled place. It was in 2002. Based on what it kind of looks like now, it's probably getting busier out that way. But then there was no through traffic, just a lot of people who live. I mean, the people who lived there were the only traffic. Medlin, let's see, those two vehicles had been there, had made more than one trip to that strip of WW White Road. Medlin said they drove slow, looking around. Whoever it was drove slow and looked around. He had tried to flag down the driver to offer to help them find what they were looking for, to no avail. The driver sped up and took off. The next day, on January 14th, Palmer and Sergeant Wedding secured permission to search the abandoned farm where the vehicles seemed to be driving by the most and where the smoke had been seen. The property was it was on a long, overgrown, remote stretch of land down the road from Medellin, and it had become an illegal dumping ground for junked cars, caliche pits, and even a trailer full of trash. It was a place one local truck driver said, if you were thinking like a criminal and you needed to dump a body someplace, that would be a great place to do it. There, amidst the desolate landscape, the investigators made a horrific discovery. They found the charred and decomposing remains of Susan McFarland. The events that followed moved fast. About an hour on January 14th, about an hour after the remains were found, state authorities took the three McFarland boys into protective custody from their schools. Less than 2 hours after that, Richard McFarland was arrested. They booked him in on vehicle theft and tampering with a witness. The remains were quickly identified using dental records. It was, without a doubt, Susan McFarland. After that, once they identified the body, then they charged him with her murder. I think that was on January 17th. The 7-week search was over, confirming the family's worst fears. We knew this day was coming, but it doesn't make it any easier, her brother, Pete Smith, said from his home in Kansas City. It's a never-ending nightmare. Richard McFarland could not post his bond, which was set at $950,000. And I think it was lowered maybe at one point to $500,000. They did not charge him with capital murder, but it was murder. The murder case against Richard McFarland was set to be one of the most high-profile trials in San Antonio history. Media interest was intense. Court TV had made plans to film the proceedings, and best-selling true crime author Ann Rule was planning on being there because she was considering writing a book about the case. The stage was set for a dramatic courtroom battle, but on January 5th, the following January, it was 2004, on January 5th, just as the jury selection was about to begin, the drama came to an abrupt end. Richard McFarland pleaded guilty to the murder of his wife, Susan. In exchange for his guilty plea, McFarland, age 46 at the time, agreed to a 40-year prison sentence. Under the terms of the deal, he would not be eligible for parole for 20 years. Court watchers speculated that the mountain of evidence and lurid details contained in the 400-page court file convinced his legal team that any attempt at a defense was doomed. And okay, so this is the official story. I'm sure you have questions about how this murder was committed from start to finish. I know I did. When there's not a trial, those details are very hard to come by. However, we have a pretty good idea because of some of the things, because Richard McFarland was so narcissistic that he didn't realize he was doing so many dumb things. The timeline of events pieced together by investigators paint a chilling picture of premeditation, murder, and deception, and a picture that explains why his lawyers saw no way out. The catalyst came on November 12, 2002, the day Susan saw an attorney. And as I mentioned, Richard tunneled into Susan's computer, read her private journal, saw how she felt about him, and he saw she had hired a lawyer. Now, they knew that because someone who digs into a computer looking for evidence knows how to find things like that. So somewhere in that computer's memory or registry or the files that it keeps to journalize its own behavior. That the investigators found it, and they knew that when they found that, they knew he had been planning Susan's murder. Richard had told investigators that when Susan left to go to Amarillo, she had taken their VCR and television from their bedroom. He didn't offer an explanation for why she took them, just kind of like, oh, she's going to visit friends and she wanted to take the TV and VCR. I said, sure. Well, investigators found that VCR and television in the burn pile, and they realized that what had probably happened is that Richard struck Susan in the head with the VCR that was in their bedroom, and it didn't kill her instantly. She had fought him and left his face with scratches, and the tip of his pinky finger was gone. So I don't know how she got that off, but good for her. But the television was probably damaged and bloody during their struggle. Later that night, neighbors heard Richard sawing in his garage. Some accounts say he cut up her body, but my source said he was cutting up a love seat that had been her mother's and that was in the bedroom. They found the coils from it at the bird site with Susan's body, so it must have gotten bloody when he killed her. The autopsy did not find any marks from tools, like a saw, but the body was in several pieces. And but they believe the autopsy showed that it was from fire and decomposition, not from being cut up. It seemed like he moved Susan's body from one vehicle to another before he removed it from their driveway. One theory is he took the body out to the old farm and left it, then went back another night to set it on fire. His trips out to the site must have included hunting the perfect place, observing it, taking the body to the site, and setting the body on fire. And that's how he was seen out there a couple of times, or more than two. Susan's hair and blood were found in the Explorer. He took the carpet up out of his white van, so he may have had her in that vehicle at some point. And it is certain that he took the blue and tan Suburban to the farm at least once, because there was a lot of Susan's DNA. He had been seen out there late at night by a fellow named Raul Ruiz, who saw Richard get out of that Suburban and was walking with carrying a sack towards the farm area. Got out and went around his vehicle. So Ruiz pulled up there to say something to him and tell him, don't be dumping trash out here. But he said that Richard had such an awful, scary look on his face that he just took off and went on home. Although Richard planned for 2 weeks how he would kill Susan, his post-crime cover-up was clumsy and damning. A neighbor saw him outside at 1:30 a.m. on November 26th, so that would have been the night that he killed Susan, furiously vacuuming his white van. That night, a pizza delivery person that night, meaning not the night he killed Susan, but the next night, a pizza delivery person noted that Richard paid for the order while wearing surgical gloves, and that when he made a trip up and down the stairs twice, going into the bedroom and then coming back out, and every time he came out, he closed that door carefully behind him, like nobody was supposed to go in there. Let's see. So he was wearing those surgical gloves when he paid for it. And I'm thinking, did you just have one pair of surgical gloves? Anyway, and why did you need them at that point? When the maid came to clean on November 29th, that would be the day after Susan was reported missing, she noticed a large, brand new vacuum cleaner hidden in one of the boys' rooms. Then there was the Weiler wrappers at the dump site indicating that Richard had been there, and they would have had his DNA on the wrappers or fingerprints of Richard. So that was, he just did a lot of really stupid things. And of course, Gil Medlin and the other witness putting those vehicles out there in that area. And actually, like I said, Ruiz actually saw Richard standing outside of the car, so he was able to, he could have identified him. In fact, when he saw Richard's picture in the newspaper, that's when he realized he had information that the police needed. Before then, he wasn't aware of it. Richard McFarland is currently imprisoned in the John M. Wynn Unit in Huntsville, according to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He was denied parole in 2025. His next parole hearing is scheduled for 2029. When he was in jail before his conviction, Richard did not get along with the other prisoners. Some were afraid of him. They had to reassign him to different cells several times. He is still not getting along with other prisoners. The tragedy of Suzanne Farland's murder has continued to resonate in San Antonio and Terrell Hills, especially after Suzanne Simpson went missing and has been declared dead as well. A 2024 article in the San Antonio Express News drew eerie parallels between Susan's case and that of Suzanne Simpson. About the children, thanks to their father murdering their mother, the court insisted he relinquish his parental rights so they could be adopted. Susan McFarland's sons, whom she loved so much, were adopted by people outside the family. The family tried to figure it out how they could place them with blood relatives, but Susan's siblings were nearing age 60 when she died. They didn't feel like they could take on the responsibility of 3 boys or even one and keep, they just weren't up to it. Susan's parents were dead. Richard's parents were in their late 70s, and Richard's siblings knew Richard would cause problems if they adopted the boys. He would always meddle in what they were doing. So his brothers just couldn't let Richard's horrible acts change their own families and take away from their own children. The youngest and middle sons went to a couple who had fostered them after Richard was arrested. The oldest boy needed a lot of counseling, and he was put into a more structured environment program where it sounded, the source didn't say it, but it sounded like he had some real issues, and he had to go first into a hospital environment. He was adopted within a couple of years, though, by an educated single woman in her 40s who had no children or husband and no one to take her attention away from him. So she was able to focus on him alone and make him feel safe and secure. Both situations are said to have worked out well, but how sad and how tragic that happened to those little boys. Susan was a beloved mother, sister, and friend, and may she rest in peace. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate you staying with me this far. If you want to know more about the McFarland case, my source was many articles from the San Antonio Express News and also the book by Diane Fanning, Gone Forever, A True Story of Marriage, Betrayal, and Murder. It was excellent, and I would have loved to have put all the details in it that Diane's book had in it, but there's just too much. So anyway, I would recommend those. And also I'll put a link to that in the notes. And also there's a channel that Matthew Gonzalez is the name of the channel, and it's on YouTube, where he took a drone out to the farm and flew it all over, so I and you could get a good you could envision it if you choose to go to his YouTube channel, and I'll put his link in too. So thank you so much for staying with me this long. I really appreciate it.